Westminster Abbey houses the remains, coffins and tombs of many of England's and Britain's greatest kings and queens. Many of the Tudor monarchs, including Elizabeth I and the first Tudor king Henry VII, are buried in vaults very close to each other. And also, the tragic Scottish queen, Mary Queen of Scots, is interred under a huge tomb opposite Elizabeth. Around the shrine of Edward the Confessor, there are many medieval kings interred alongside their queens inside of tombs, and over the centuries, many of these have been opened, and what has been found is shocking and remarkable, some 600 or even 700 years after their deaths. The truth about Westminster Abbey is that the majority of royal tombs have been opened, and their coffins of the former kings and queens have even been opened and examined and explored. There are only very few royal burials which have not been disturbed, and the royal coffins have been subjected to desecration, damage and decay because of the intrigue around what's inside, and also the not ideal conditions of the church. In this video documentary, we look at the stories of those kings and queens who are buried inside of Westminster Abbey, who have had their coffins broken into. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Elizabeth I ended the life of one of her greatest opponents, Mary Queen of Scots, by having her executed inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle. But Elizabeth I also managed to defeat the Spanish Armada, the greatest enemy and army of the time across Europe, but Elizabeth was a queen who was loved by her followers and population, and she was very popular. Following her death in 1603, there was a huge outpouring of grief across England and the nation, and many people could not see what the nation would be like without her reigning over them. However, following her death, she was interred in a burial vault with her grandfather, Henry VII, before she was then dug up and moved to her final resting place. But what is this burial vault like, and why was it broken into? It was in the morning of the 24th of March 1603 that Elizabeth I died. She had suffered in the final months of her life with depression, and she had ruled for a very long time. But she was an elderly woman by the standards of the early 17th century, and she had lived for some time. She had defied many bouts of illness throughout her life, and she had beaten smallpox, a deadly disease that struck many people across England every year. But one issue that Elizabeth's court had with regards to her death was what to do with the throne following her death. She did not have any children. Because of this, the Scottish King James was invited to reign over England and Scotland, and he was the son of Mary Queen of Scots, the very woman that Elizabeth had executed. Elizabeth I in her final days was very depressed, and she often was very vacant and seemed deep in thought. She was contemplating the executions that she had ordered, and this included the execution of Mary. And she believed that this would stop her getting into heaven because she had sanctioned the execution of another anointed queen, who many believed had been sent by God to rule the Scots. But Elizabeth I was almost 70 when she went onto her deathbed, and she was accompanied by her closest friends and servants, and she was then attended on by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He offered the Queen spiritual guidance, and he told her that she would rule again in heaven as a queen. But her close friends who had died in the months before were in her thoughts, and Elizabeth believed she would one day see them again in the afterlife. And she was told to hold God in her thoughts, who would guide her through. However, the Queen's throat swelled and she struggled to speak, and because of this, many knew that death was coming. Inside of her private bedroom in Richmond Palace, Elizabeth I died, and she had left instructions as what should happen to her remains following her death. She specifically did not want to be disemboweled during the embalming process, but this was not listened to. During this process, the royal doctors and physicians cut open the Queen's body, and they removed her heart and also her other organs, and then her chest was stuffed with spices. to keep away decay in an effort to preserve her before her funeral. But this proved to be the correct decision, as during the procession to her burial site of Westminster Abbey, it's believed that her body exploded due to the release of a number of gases, and that the explosion then even splintered the coffin and caused damage to it. However, Elizabeth, after her death, was then placed inside of a lead-lined coffin which had been decorated with Tudor imagery, and she was left inside of Richmond Palace before it was then time for the funeral procession. The journey was rather long, and it gave the public a chance to see their queen and to pay their respects to her. Elizabeth's coffin was placed on the royal barge and was then transported down the River Thames and then travelled towards the Palace of Whitehall. The coffin was covered in black velvet and her ladies kept watch on it. However, it was claimed that during the procession on the Thames that the oars at every stroke did tears let fall, and it was a very sorry sight. One onlooker wrote of the funeral procession that begun on the 28th of April 1603 that the city of Westminster was subcharged with a multitude of all sorts of people in the streets, houses, leads and gutters that came to see the obsequies. There was such a general sighing, groaning and weeping as the like has not been seen or known in the memory of man. On top of Elizabeth I's coffin was also her funeral effigy, which was dressed in her Parliament robes, and on the head of the effigy was the crown of the Queen. In her hands were the sceptres of power, and this was significant, as this was a first time for most that they had seen an image of their Queen. When the coffin arrived at Westminster Abbey, it was carried into the church by the yeomen of the guard, and the funeral of the Queen was conducted by Dean Andrews of Westminster. And following this, her coffin was taken to the Lady Chapel ready for burial. To begin with, the burial vault was actually the same as Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's, and she was buried under the tomb of her grandparents, which was said to have been an honour, and at the heart of the Lady Chapel. But then following this, her body would be moved later on. James I, the Queen's successor, was determined to win over his new population, and one way in which he did this was to honour Elizabeth, as she was so popular. He ordered a large tomb to be built for her, but he also ordered that Elizabeth should be exhumed and then moved to a different vault, the vault being her half-sister's, Mary I's, resting place, and it was then said that Elizabeth's coffin should be placed directly on top of Mary's to express her dominance over her half-sister in her reign. This tomb for Elizabeth is huge and is still there today, and she was buried in a room opposite her rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. It was said that 46 shillings and 4 pence was paid for the removal of Elizabeth's body, and then for the reburial in the new vault. However, in 1880, a book was published by the Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley, and in this he documents his exploration into the different vaults and burial sites of Westminster Abbey. He had been given special permission to look inside the royal vaults, and he wanted to locate the coffin of King James I. And he did find this in the burial vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. So James had moved Elizabeth I out of this vault so that he could then be buried inside of it. But Arthur Stanley then explored some other rooms from the royal vault, and he came across an aisle underground at the east end of the tomb of Elizabeth I. And he found a small opening in the wall where he then crept through and entered the burial vault of Elizabeth I and Mary I. There were no other coffins, but Elizabeth I's remains had been laid to rest for 2 centuries. He wrote about what he saw and said, "The excavations, however, had almost laid bare the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view was obtained into a low, narrow vault immediately beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed 2 coffins, and 2 only, and it could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary, the upper one larger, and more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except that the centering wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides and had drawn away part vault of the decaying lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately the dim light fell on a fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There was the Tudor badge, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in outline on the middle of the cover. On each side, the august initials E.R., and below, the memorable date, 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with narrow moulded panelling. The coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid containing the inscription and panelling was of fine oak, half an inch thick, laid on the inch elm cover. The whole was covered in red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak cover, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded and narrow tomb, thus compressing in the closest grasp the two Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection. The solemn majesty of the great queen thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive form, the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and of the fullness of its tragic interest with the vacancy of the deserted spaces which had been inherited too, explored in the other part of the chapel. The vault was then immediately closed. Not since Arthur Stanley ventured into the burial vault of Elizabeth I has anyone, it's believed, ever been in and documented what they saw. It's considered a sacred space, and the final Tudor monarch is laid to rest in a better manner than others inside of Westminster Abbey had been. Henry V, throughout his early life, probably never expected to become the king, but his father, Henry IV, did manage to depose his cousin, Richard II. After his father was exiled, Richard II actually took the future Henry V into his custody and treated him well, but when his father came back to usurp Richard II, Henry then embarked in a career in the armed forces. He was commanding much of the English army, and he led forces against the Welsh, and he helped stave off the troops of Henry Hotspur Percy during the Battle of Shrewsbury. But at the age of 16, Prince Henry was almost killed as he was shot in his left cheekbone by an arrow. He was given the best care, and a wound that would have usually killed ordinary soldiers got better. He was treated with honey as an antiseptic, and he managed to extract dirt from the wound and was left with scars, but he did recover well. Henry continued to fight on against the Welsh, but he became the king on the 20th of March 1413 and was crowned weeks later at Westminster Abbey on the 9th of April. There was a huge snowstorm during this, and people in England thought it was a bad omen. Henry was a very tall man, and he was said to have had eyes flashed from the mildness of a dove to the brilliance of lions. And, as king, he worked on a number of changes to England, and he dealt with former rivals well, and gave everyone a clean slate. When he was encountering danger, he dealt with it well, showing that he was a competent and a good leader. He also ordered the use of English in his government rather than Old English and French, and he wrote in English, but with regards to his problems in France, with the 100 Years' War raging on, he needed to show his strength on the battlefield. Henry's best known for the Battle of Agincourt, in which he led the English army to a spectacular victory against the French. He was given the promise of the French throne after the death of the French king, and was made the heir to the French throne. The brilliant work he did for the English against the French during the 100 Years' War would later be undone in the years after his death. However, on his deathbed he claimed that he wanted to live longer to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. The warrior king wanted to embark on a final crusade to the Holy Land. On the 31st of August 1422, whilst at the Château de Vaucancy in France, Henry V died. He was 35 years old, and it's believed that he died from dysentery, which he caught in the days after the siege of Meaux. He quickly succumbed to his death, and some historians claimed that he died from a different condition, or a disease such as smallpox. In France at the time, it was incredibly hot in the summer months, and Henry V was riding around in a full set of armour, and he caught a terrible fever, probably caused by heat stroke. However, he never got better. He would spend some time being carried around by those who attended on him, as he was so weak, and he could not mount his horse as he was so weak. He was then waited on for a few more weeks, and then he succumbed to his death. He had ruled over England for only 9 years, and despite being considered one of the greatest kings, he only ruled for a brief period, unlike some of his predecessors. He also never met his successor, King Henry VI, who was just a very young baby when he took the throne of England and also France. The body of the English king was then taken across the English Channel, and his brother brought the remains back to his capital. It had rested inside a ruined cathedral for some time, and the funeral procession was massive as the coffin was taken from Dover to St Paul's Cathedral. On top of his coffin was Henry V's life-sized effigy, which showed the king with a crown on his head and a sceptre of power in his hand. His coffin was taken to Westminster Abbey on the 7th of November 1422 for his funeral and his burial. It was a huge spectacle, and horses carried the king's coffin into Westminster Abbey on a chariot. Money was given by Henry V for a chantry chapel to be erected over his coffin and tomb following his interment, and the tomb was a large one too. It had a significant inscription around the side that reads, "Henry V, Hammer of the Gauls lies here." Henry was put in the urn 1422. Virtue conquers all. The fair Catherine finally joined her husband, 1437, flee idleness. On top of the tomb is a lifelike effigy of the king, which is made from silver, and other symbols are found on the tomb, as well as a lion resting at his feet, showing his power, that the most powerful of animals were under Henry V's feet. Some of the items used in the funeral procession, such as a shield and a helmet, have been stood the test of time and can be seen inside of Westminster Abbey today. However, there was a huge discovery made in 1953 regarding the tomb of King Henry V. For over 500 years his tomb and coffin had been sealed and had not been opened, with Henry being one of the few kings who was not disturbed in their coffins and tombs. But in the 20th century, the decision was made to try and open the tomb, and is not recorded as for the reason for the investigation. His tomb was opened, and he had some work done on his tomb in the years following. However, it claimed that during the investigation work regarding his tomb, the remains of another man may have been discovered as sharing a tomb with the former English king. A small hole in the floor of the base of the northern turret of Henry V's chantry was discovered, and there was a cavity underneath. With this, the excavation of the remains of a man of 6 foot in height was found in a stone-lined grave, along with a crozier and a gold ring. The grave had been disturbed when the chantry was built, and these remains belonged to the Bishop of Norwich and close friend of Henry V, Richard Courtenay. Courtenay had been with Henry V in France and had died of illness at the siege of Harfleur, but then Henry V had his remains repatriated back to Westminster Abbey, and he was buried next to, if not within, the same tomb as Henry V. He was a trusted friend and advisor to Henry V, hence why he ordered his remains to be interred in the place that the king had probably outlined for his own burial. Some have considered why Henry V and Richard Courtenay were buried very close to each other. Some historians have speculated if there could be anything more than friends. However, this is unlikely. The bishop had died years before Henry V, and he had been laid to rest in a grave right next to where Henry V was buried, and the floor in the base of the chantry discovered Courtenay's remains. There was nothing inside of Henry V's testament and will that he would be buried with anyone. It was assumed that his wife would be laid to rest alongside him, but this never occurred, and Catherine of Valois' remains were actually subjected to a harrowing amount of defilement over a period of 400 years. But Henry V was a warrior king, and he was someone who for many years wanted to conquer France, and he would succeed in his determination to be made the heir to the French king. His son, Henry VI, did succeed him as the King of France and England, but he would be very young, and he never lived up to his father's high kingly standards. But in the years following, Henry V's reputation is one of being a brilliant yet ruthless king. But the mystery about the burial of one of his closest friends practically under his tomb is one that is less known about than his stunning victory at Agincourt. But the plan was for Edward VI to reign for a long time, and for his son's children to then continue the Tudor dynasty for centuries. But this never happened, as at the age of 15 inside of Greenwich Palace, the ill King of England succumbed to a terrible death, and he was for his last few months suffering. Edward VI was buried following his death inside of Westminster Abbey, but his resting place for a long time was lost. However, in the centuries after, his coffin was located and his coffin was even opened. And what those curious people found when they opened the casket was shocking. When Edward VI was just 9, his father, Henry VIII, died and was then crowned king inside of Westminster Abbey. A regency council was established to help him rule, and at the top of this was Edward Seymour, his uncle, the Lord Protector. However, in 1550, Edward VI was stricken with a mysterious illness which was very serious, and the royal doctors and physicians believed that this was possible, that Edward could have died, and because of this they were worried who would become king or queen next if Edward, the young boy, did die. However, Edward VI did recover from this, and this bout of ill health was kept a secret. But in the years following, the boy king did suffer another illness which was deadly. He would before this catch measles and also smallpox, but he did manage to recover again, showing that he was strong and was not always sickly and could demonstrate strength. But the king was at this time a little deaf and also wore glasses. However, in the December of 1552, things took a turn for the worse. Edward VI began to show signs of tuberculosis and measles, and the measles had caused the problems with his immune system. On the 15th of February 1553, it was said that the king was sick with a feverish cold, and Mary, his eldest sister, came to visit him. However, he was during this meeting bedridden, and he was displaying a very violent cough. Some rumours dominated the royal household that he had been poisoned, but to many, the king's health remained a secret. He had a number of different symptoms, which were all very serious, and the best doctors and physicians across England were brought in to treat him. One woman, who it's believed was almost like a faith healer, was let into the king's apartments, and she administered a potion that almost killed the king and caused his limbs to swell up. However, on the 17th of March 1553, things continued to take a turn for the worst. Edward VI, the son of King Henry VIII, was now a thin and weak young boy who was very gaunt, and the doctors recorded that he was approaching his death. In the April of 1553, his health did pick up slightly as he was spotted walking in a local park, and he was then sent to Greenwich Palace to recover. But it was here where he would die. Edward was seen in the gardens growing weaker, but he was coughing up blood, and some doctors still believed he would recover. But there was a belief that there was a tumour in his lungs causing his high fever, but his stomach was very swollen, and he also broke out in sores and ulcers. On the 17th of May 1553, he met with European ambassadors, and he was very weak during this, but his body continued to swell, as did his head and legs, and he was given tablets to help him sleep. However, then, adaptations were made to the line of succession, and the throne was then to be given to Edward's cousin, Lady Jane Grey. In mid-June, he was not eating, and doctors predicted that he had a matter of days left to live. The king's last few days were horrific, as he could only lay on his back and his hair was falling out. On the 1st of July, he was spotted by a crowd at a window, but on the 6th of July, 1553, Edward VI, at around 8 in the evening, died in the arms of Sir Henry Sidney. He said his final words, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." The doctors then, following his death, opened up his chest, and they found out that the king's lungs were infected, and he had 2 ulcers on them. Edward VI's body was embalmed, and then sealed in a lead coffin for burial, and he was then to be buried inside of Westminster Abbey. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, officiated the service, and the funeral procession was similar to King Henry VIII's. Edward's body was taken by barge to Whitehall, and the night before the funeral he was taken to Westminster Abbey, along with a large procession, and it was a huge event of pageantry. Many people cried and were upset when they saw the king's coffin, and once his body was taken into the abbey, it was surrounded by burning candles. The funeral service was performed, and Edward VI's body was lowered into a white marble vault in front of an altar which had been made by Pietro Torrigiano for his grandfather, Henry VII. There were plans considered for Edward VI's funeral, and there was a debate as to place Edward VI inside of a tomb, close to where his father Henry VIII had been buried in St George's Chapel in Windsor, but the tomb was never finished or worked on. Edward VI's burial vault itself was very small, measuring 2.3 metres long and 75 centimetres wide, and this was close to the entrance of a much larger vault of his grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the founders of the Tudor dynasty. There were later talks, even later on, to bury Edward VI alongside his half-sister Mary I in the same tomb, but as mentioned, nothing would ever be made for the boy king. However, during the English Civil War of the 17th century, the altar marking where Edward VI was buried was destroyed by Puritans in 1643, and it's believed that the burial vault of Edward may have also at this time been disturbed or broken into. This was common at the time for many royal burials, as Puritans and other parliamentarians ransacked tombs and burials of those who were a symbol of the monarchy. But centuries later, in 1868, fragments of the altar were found, and a new one was then built marking where Edward VI was buried. However, the burial vault of Edward VI was then opened, and the Tudor king's coffin was found. It was said in 1868, when the royal vault was opened, that Edward VI's outer coffin, the wooden shell that had been partly cleared away, and it was damaged, meaning that someone had previously been in and had done this to the vault. It could have been the Puritans. However, there had been some damage to Edward's coffin and also some effort to even possibly break into his tomb. It was also said that the lead coffin of the boy Tudor king had deformed as well as wasted by long corrosion. Because of this, it meant that Edward VI's remains were on display and could be seen through the coffin, and there were no repairs done to give the Tudor king a new coffin. It was said the cerecloth had fallen away and showed that no hair was attached to the skull. This meant that Edward VI's remains had decayed and that his remains were now skeletal, and the cerecloth had not done its job to preserve the remains as best as they could, and this may have been caused by the damage to the coffin. Edward VI's coffin had been damaged by someone, or something such as internal gases building up and exploding inside of the coffin. However, the more probable possibility is that it was broken into and damaged when the Puritans attacked the altar next to his remains. But today there is no tomb for Edward VI, marking his small burial vault, except a small memorial stone that states, "In memory of King Edward VI, buried in this chapel. This stone was placed here by the Christ's Hospital in thanksgiving for their founder, the 7th of October, 1966. Edward VI was the great hope for the Tudor dynasty, and he was the son that Henry VIII greatly wished for and wanted. However, his life was tinged with sadness and tragedy. As his teenage years, he died a very painful death, and his demise was horrific and brutal. But the mysterious damage to Edward's coffin inside of the burial vault was never repaired, and there were no efforts to sort this out, meaning that today Edward VI's skull may still be sitting inside of a damaged coffin. One of the most influential and notorious royal families in history was the Tudors, and their kings and queens would change the face of England forever. Henry VIII was known for his brutality, and he would have 6 wives, 2 of whom he executed inside the walls of the Tower of London. But Henry was never meant to have been king. It was his father, Henry VII, who founded the Tudor dynasty and ended the Wars of the Roses by marrying Elizabeth of York. But Henry VII reigned for a period of around 24 years, and he brought a lot of stability to the throne. But he died at the age of 52, leaving England in the hands of his son, Henry VIII, who would bring the nation under a significant number of changes himself. But did you know that Henry VII's burial vault was opened a number of times throughout the years? Henry VII became the King of England by the right of conquest, and he then married Elizabeth of York to unite the warring factions of the Wars of the Roses and to bring an end to decades of disputes over the rightful king. Some saw Henry as a usurper who had dethroned the rightful King Richard, but he faced a number of rebellions in the years after that came in the form of pretenders, with these claiming they were the princes in the Tower, or Edward V, the boy king who had disappeared from sight inside the Tower of London. He managed to put them down and would show a ruthless side, as he had some of his enemies executed. This showed that Henry VII was someone not to be crossed. Henry was not someone who knew how to run a nation, and he had a number of close advisors who helped him do this. He was more prudent than other monarchs, and he made the crown very rich, through raising taxes and increasing the ruthlessness in which these were collected. But some people were not happy to pay this. Henry VII was a man who was very shrewd, and throughout his reign one of the major boom industries was wool and cloth inside of England, and this was then traded around the world. He also increased his stranglehold over law and order, introducing justices of peace to make sure the nation's laws were being adhered to. Henry VII, despite having differing popularity, did manage to increase stability in the monarchy following the Civil War. But in 1502, Elizabeth of York and Henry VII's first son, Arthur, died. He was the heir to the throne and was very much the man expected to become the next Tudor king. He had died following his marriage to Catherine of Aragon inside of Ludlow Castle and passed away from the sweating sickness. This loss hurt the king greatly, and for a man who rarely showed any emotion in public, he was overwhelmed by grief. Henry VII would cry uncontrollably at court. However, further heartbreak came a year later as his wife, Elizabeth of York, died inside the Tower of London. She had just given birth, but days later both Elizabeth and the child died, and with this Henry VII was devastated and he shut himself away, and it was said he himself became very ill and almost died from this unknown illness. It was said the only woman who could bring him out of his upset was his mother, but following Elizabeth's death, he did consider remarrying. In February of 1508, it was noted that the king was suffering from gout, and it was also reported months later that he was in the last stages of consumption. Writers of the time noted how, in the final years of his life, that Henry VII had become sicker more often, and that things were getting more serious each time. It was also reported around this time that Henry VII was very ill and in extremis, and that he was very ill without hope of recovery. But the king managed to battle on as long as he could, and by the end of March 1509 he knew that death was on the horizon, and he drafted his last will and testament. The decline in the king's health was brought about by the fact he was grieving his wife and his son, and many of his close friends and loyal advisers also around this time became sick and ill. With this, Henry VII made sure there would be a seamless transition of power for his son Henry VIII to come onto the throne after his death. Accounts of the death of Henry VII mostly come from Bishop John Fisher. He stated that he said how 2 nights before the king's death he became so weak that he could not hear mass at the altar, and had struggled for some time to eat and drink. However, he was keen to do his religious duty, and he summoned his confessor to his bedside to hear the sacrament. Mass at his bedside was heard. At Henry it was said to have been a very moving spectacle. It was said that those who witnessed Henry receiving the sacrament were moved with a marvellous compassion and flow of tears, that at some time they wept and sobbed by the space of 3/4 of an hour. On the day of his death he heard Mass again, and this time held the crucifix a number of times with great reverence, embracing it tenderly and kissing it. He was in a significant amount of pain and was suffering and scared, and he in his final moments appealed to Jesus to deliver his soul and to protect him. It was said he claimed, "O my blessed Jesus, O my Lord, deliver my soul from the misery of this world. Deliver my soul from these deadly pains. Deliver my could from this corruptible body." In his final moments, the king's son, Prince Henry, who was just 17 at the time, was summoned to his father's bedside for his final instructions, and the king said, "Fatherly and godly exhortations committed unto him the laborious governance of this realm of England." However, the original plan was for Henry VII to be buried inside of Windsor, and work had begun on rebuilding part of the chapel as a tomb house, but this was never finished. However, the Lady Chapel inside of Westminster Abbey was being remodelled also, and this would become the resting place of Henry VII. His wife, Elizabeth of York, had been interred in a grave near the new Lady Chapel, but following Henry VII's death, the pair were then interred inside of a large burial vault in the heart of the chapel before the altar and opposite the tomb of Henry's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. But Henry VII's tomb was actually placed in an eastern position in the chapel, presumably by Henry VIII, to then make way for his own burial. The tomb cost a huge sum of £1,500 and was made by Pietro Torrengiano of Florence. The monument has a black marble tomb chest and is ornamented with copper gilt, and also features the bronze effigies of the king and his queen. Henry VII and Elizabeth's coffins were buried here in a vault beneath the monument and tomb, and this vault is 2.7 metres long and 1.5 metres wide and high, and it is not the smallest. The lead coffins were covered with symbols such as Maltese crosses. However, the burial vault of Henry VII was broken into a number of times. The vault was opened first in 1603, and this was hugely significant, as the body of Elizabeth I and her coffin was placed inside the same vault. Because of the size of the vault, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's coffin may have had to have been moved to the side. Elizabeth I's burial inside the same vault was significant, as it was marking her as a very important Tudor monarch, and one of the greatest, and it was an honour for her in death. However, she would not be laid to rest for long, as when James I came onto the throne, he ordered her to be buried in a vault with her half-sister, Mary I. Elizabeth I's coffin was removed and reburied elsewhere in Westminster Abbey, and then following the death of James I, his body was then interred inside of Henry VII's burial vault himself. It's almost as if James had Elizabeth I moved for himself. To incorporate James I's coffin, the outer wooden shells of Henry VII's coffin and Elizabeth of York's were removed to make room, and this left the first Tudor king and queen inside of their lead cases. But also at this point, the visceral urns of Henry and Elizabeth may have been moved elsewhere. These were the boxes and urns that held the hearts and internal organs of the king and queen after their death, and they were removed during the embalming process. But again, the vault of Henry VII would be opened one more time in 1869 by the curious Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley. He was looking for the coffin of James I, and of course he found this alongside Henry VII, and he commented on the lead shrouded body of Henry VII. He also sketched what he saw, and it was rather disturbing of an image, with the 3 shrouded bodies lying inside the vault eerily. Henry VII is remembered for being a steady king who brought stability following the Wars of the Roses. He was a man who would not spend too much during his reign, and he lived within his means, but taxed his population harshly at times, making the crown very rich. He would be buried inside the heart of his new mausoleum, the Lady Chapel, and he hoped that this would become a Tudor mausoleum for centuries to come. Within a century of his death, the Tudor period came to an end, and it would be the death of his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, who brought an end to the Tudor period. For his height, Edward I was sometimes referred to as Edward Longshanks, and he was always destined to become the king. He was the oldest son of King Henry III, and he married at a young age Eleanor of Castile, a well-thought-of European princess. As a prince, he began to command armies, and he made a significant number of enemies inside of Wales and Scotland, and he was someone who was trusted by his soldiers and forces. His father, the king, allowed him to rampage and fight the enemies of the English on his behalf, and Edward I was crowned king on the 19th of August 1274 inside of Westminster Abbey, following his father's death. As a prince, many believed that Edward was someone who would not have been fit for king, and some believed at the time that he would become a tyrant due to his ruthless nature and his violent attacks upon his enemies, but he was someone who took the role and job of king seriously, and he was loyal to those around him, and he continued to hone his craft as a military commander and leader. Those around him believed he was very good-looking and tough, and he was fit for the job, but he became a more patient man who was devoted to religion, and he also accepted the council of Parliament in helping him rule. He was, by all accounts, the perfect king for medieval England, strong, intelligent, and level-headed. However, he would expand the power and influence of England through his conquests to the west and also the north. He attacked Wales and almost brought the country to its knees, invading and blockading the Welsh forces, which led to them surrendering. He besieged Welsh towns and castles and forces that the Welsh would accept him as their ruler, and he would for years later ruthlessly put down Welsh rebellions and uprising against the English. He even had one of his sons born there, his eldest, who then took on the title of the Prince of Wales, and this is still a tradition today. But Edward I would also shatter the peace established between England and the Scots, and he rampaged across the border and wanted more land and power inside of the northern country, which he believed was a vassal state to England. He wanted Scotland to fund England and be answerable to the English crown, and he was given influence inside of the nations, as he even managed to choose a puppet king to rule over Scotland. But in battles and campaigns against William Wallace and his troops, Edward became known, and he would get his own back on Wallace, who was regarded as a rebel, having him brought to London, where he was then tried as a traitor and was then in front of a huge crowd hanged, drawn and quartered. By the year 1306, Edward I was a very elderly man, and he had lived a long life by the standards of medieval England. Healthcare was virtually non-existent, despite the fact he was king. But Edward was becoming very ill. He would spend a large amount of money on importing foreign medicines and potions that he believed would treat him, and also importing leggings from Europe to help deal with problems from his legs. Edward I would also be kept inside of a neck brace, and he probably suffered with arthritis and joint pain. To relieve this, the king took regular herbal baths also, but whilst travelling towards Scotland for one more military campaign, he was taken gravely ill. The king wanted to destroy the Scots once and for all, but on the 6th of July 1307, at Borough by Sands in the north of England, King Edward I was resting inside of his tent. The next morning his servants tried to wake him up, and as they then entered the tent, they knew something was wrong. They lifted Edward's body, and he felt cold and limp, and in the evening he had died. A number of rumours that emerged about what happened to his remains, and one of these was that his heart was cut out and was taken to the Holy Lands to be used by crusaders as a holy relic. And there were other rumours that his bones were to be taken every time armies travelled into Scotland to fight the Scots for good luck as a relic. But the reality was that Edward I's body was sent south, and it took many days to get back towards London. It arrived in Waltham Abbey in Essex and lay in state there, and in the September of 1307 his funeral was being prepared. It was then the following month that his body was moved to the monastery of the Holy Trinity, before it finally got to St Paul's Cathedral in London, ready for the funeral procession. Edward I's body arrived at Westminster Abbey on the 26th of October 1307, and the funeral ceremony was large, and the king was buried inside of his coffin, which was lead-lined. He was inside of the coffin wearing his coronation robes, and this included a cloth of gold, lower garments, and also a red silk tunic. He was very much buried in his best clothes. On Edward I's head was a crown, and in his hands were the sceptres of office, and he was placed inside of a plain black Purbeck marble tomb. There was no effigy created of Edward, despite the fact inside of Westminster Abbey many of the earlier kings' tombs have effigies on them, and this is still the case. But in the years following Edward I's death, a number of stories did come around about the state of his remains and burials. Some believed that the tomb was a temporary resting site, only as a plan was, according to his wishes, for Edward's corpse to be boiled down and then taken on crusades to fight alongside crusaders in the Holy Land. The tomb and coffin were opened many times throughout the following centuries, and what was discovered was shocking. The first time the coffin was opened was roughly 70 years after his death. It was stated inside the records that, to the treasurer and chamberlains, order of the king's money to renew the wax about the body of King Edward I, buried in the church of St Peter, Westminster, as used hereforto to be done. What this meant was that the coffin was opened for the remains of Edward to be rewrapped in wax and cerecloth, the heavy, thick, protective cloth his body was shrouded in, to preserve it. This would have been an expensive process, but was aimed at keeping the king's remains in a good state by renewing the wax around it. It's possible that his remains were completely recapped, rather than just extra wax being placed on it. However, this is doubtful due to the next time the coffin was opened, the king's remains were found in a remarkable condition. In 1774, over 400 years since the death of Edward I, the coffin was opened yet again, but what was found this time was that the state of his remains were brilliant, considering that he had died such a long time ago. It was written about this that the chin and lips were entire, but without any beard, and a sinking or dip between the chin and underlip was very conspicuous. Both the lips were prominent, the nose short, as if shrunk, but the apertures of the nostrils were visible. There was an unusual fall or cavity on the part of the bridge of the nose which separates the orbis of the eyes, and some globular substance, possibly fleshly part of the eyeballs, was movable in their sockets under the envelope. It was said, on lifting up the lid of the tomb, the royal body was found wrapped in a strong and thick linen cloth, waxed on the inside. The head and face were covered with sudarium, or face cloth of crimson, sarcenet wrapped to 3 folds, comfortable to the napkin used by our Saviour in ways to his crucifixion. On flinging open the external mantle, the corpse was discovered in all the signs of majesty richly habited. The body was wrapped in a fine linen cerecloth, closely fitted to every part of the body, even to the very fingertips and face. The writs ordering the renewal of the wax and covering of the body of Edward I, being extant, gave rise to this search. Over the cerecloth was a tunic of red silk damask. Above that a stole of thick white tissue crossed the breast. On this, at 6 inches distance from each other, quarterfollis of figure, work of gilt metal set with stones, imitating rubies, sapphires, amethysts, and to the intervals between the quatrefoils on the stole, powdered within minutes, white beads tracked down into the most elegant embroidery. in form not unlike what is called the true lover's knot. The king's clothes that he had been buried in were still shimmering, and was said that above these habits was the royal mantle of rich crimson satin, fastened on the left shoulder with a magnificent fibula of gilt metal richly chased, and ornamental with 4 pieces of red and 4 of blue transparent paste, 24 more pearls. The corpse from the waist downwards was covered with a rich cloth of figured gold, which fell down on the feet and was tucked beneath them. On the back of each hand was a quarterfoil like those on the stole. In the king's right hand was a sceptre, with a cross of copper gilt and an elegant workmanship reaching to the right shoulder. In the left hand was the rod and dove, which passed over the shoulders and reached to the ear. The dove stood on a bull placed on the 3 ranges of oak leaves of enamelled green. The dove was white enamel. On the head was a crown chased with trefoils made of gilt metal. The head itself was lodged in the cavity of the stone coffin, always observable in those receptacle of the dead. The corpse was dressed in conformity with ancient usage, even as early as the time of Saxon Sebit. Despite the fact that Edward I had been buried in a rather plain tomb, there had been very successful attempts to preserve his body and remains inside of Westminster Abbey, and his body was said to have been in a brilliant state because of this. It was not expected for it to be in this way, but Edward's body had been protected well. He was a warrior king and was probably one of the greatest kings that England had ever had. After being buried inside of Peterborough Cathedral for some time, Mary Queen of Scots' son, James I, who had become King of England following her death, arranged for a large tomb monument to be created for his mother inside of Westminster Abbey. Mary had requested to be buried in France alongside the remains of her first husband, but this was ignored, and the burial of her inside of Peterborough Cathedral was done as it was relatively close to the site of her death, but also it denied Mary being buried inside of Westminster Abbey, the place where kings and queens were buried. But James I, her son, then ordered that Mary Queen of Scots should be reinterred inside of Westminster, and her body in 1612 was exhumed from the grave in Peterborough. The coffin was carefully removed and was placed on a cart, ready to be processed down to London for burial in Westminster Abbey. She was interred inside of Westminster Abbey in the October of 1612, and the funeral was said to have been rather large and spectacular. The tomb of Mary Queen of Scots shows her in a recumbent pose and manner, and a huge tomb in the south aisle of the Lady Chapel was constructed for her. It is made from white marble and is under an elaborate canopy. On the tomb, Mary is wearing a close-fitting coif and a lace ruff, and also a long mantle, and at her feet stands proudly a Scottish lion that is crowned. Ornamental railings also surround the tomb, and there is an inscription in Latin on the side. Part of this reminds of her fate, and it says, "May it be forbidden to slaughter monarchs, that henceforward the land of Britain may never more flow with purple blood. May this precedent of the violent murder of the anointed queen come to naught. May the instigator and perpetrator rush headlong to destruction. Should she, after her own death, be vindicated by all the well deposed, then executioners, torturers, gaols and gallows, all would cease. The queen accomplished that journey which the heavenly powers allotted. God bestowed happy times, hard times." Mary Queen of Scots is buried in a burial vault underneath the tomb. Her coffin was placed neatly at the time inside of the vault in the centre, but then over the following centuries, this vault inside of Westminster Abbey became a place which was filled with the coffins of many members of the Stuart royal family, the Scottish royal family of which Mary was the head of. Each time someone died, the vault of Mary Queen of Scots, which was rather large by the standards of Westminster Abbey, was opened, and the coffin was placed inside. Mary's vault was nearby 4 metres long and 3 metres wide, and roughly 2 metres high. And although this does not sound too big, many coffins were crammed and rammed into this chamber. Many of the Queen's descendants, even down to the reign of the last Tudor monarch, Queen Anne, were placed inside of this vault. But during the 19th century and the reign of Queen Victoria, the Dean of Westminster Abbey, Arthur Stanley, began a quest to search of a missing coffin of the Abbey. Dean Stanley was searching for the coffin of King James I, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, as it was not documented where the coffin of the Stuart king was buried. With this, he searched many of the burial vaults, and later, James I's coffin was located in the burial vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But during this search, Dean Stanley opened up the burial vault of Mary, Queen of Scots, and it was said that he had a rather disturbing surprise inside of the vault, and he later described the sight in the vault as an awful scene, which was shocking. He recorded his findings in a book, and in this he wrote about what he saw. He claimed along the north wall were 2 coffins, much compressed and distorted by the superincumbent weight of 4 or 5 lesser coffins heaped upon them. The upper one of these was that of Mary, Queen of Scots, the lower that of Lady Arabella Stuart. No plate, as in a coffin plate, could be found on either, but the upper one, meaning Mary's, was much broken, and the bones, especially the skull, turned on one side, were distinctly visible, thus agreeing that the account of the coffin of Arabella Stuart, a previous search which took place in the vault. The lower coffin was saturated with pitch and was deeply compressed by the 8 above, but the lead had not given way. What Dean Stanley described in these observations was shocking. He claimed that Mary, Queen of Scots' coffin was sat on top of Lady Arabella Stuart's, and that this had over the centuries become so damaged that the bones of Mary, Queen of Scots, could be seen inside of the vault, and that her skin, despite the embalming process, had been decayed inside of the vault. It was later discovered that in fact Mary's coffin was the one below, and that Lady Arabella Stuart's was on top. Mary's head, as it was taken off, probably was sewn back on after her execution, but the indication by the observations showed that her skull had come to one side and had turned over inside of the vault. He also noticed that the coffin on top of Mary's, that of Lady Arabella Stuart, had been covered in pitch, some form of resin, which may have interfered with the decaying process and may have caused further decomposition of the remains, and this would have affected Mary's bones. It was later also claimed by Dean Stanley, speaking about Mary's coffin, that it was of a more solid and stately character, and was shaped to meet the form of the body like another presently to Mary Queen be noticed, which would exactly agree with the age and rank of Mary. The difficulty in removing the whole weight of the chest would itself have proved a bar to any closer examination, but in fact it was felt not to be needed for any purpose of historical verification, and the presence of the fatal coffin which had received the headless corpse at Fotheringhay was sufficiently affecting, without endeavouring to penetrate further into its mournful contents. It cannot be questioned that this, and this alone, must be the coffin of the Queen of Scots, its position by the north wall close to Henry, Prince of Wales, who must have been laid here a few months after her removal from Peterborough, its peculiar form, its suitableness in age and situation were decisive as to the fact. He was in no doubt that the battered and banged coffin was of Mary, Queen of Scots. He ended with, on top of this must have been laid Arabella Stuart in her frail and ill-constructed receptacle, and thus for many years those 3 alone, with the exception of Charles I's 2 infant children, occupied the vault. Then came the numerous funerals. Mary Queen of Scots' coffin was decayed significantly, but was in a better state than the other coffin inside there of Arabella Stuart. It was stated that Mary's coffin was well constructed and was shaped in a human shape, presumably a round part at the top of the head. However, there were many other Stuarts buried inside of this vault, and a vault stone does note the different people's coffins interred there. It's claimed that Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, Arabella Stuart, 4 children of King Charles I, Elizabeth, Queen of Bohemia, Prince Rupert, her son, Anne Hyde, the first wife of James II, and 10 of his infant children, William, the Duke of Gloucester, and 17 other infant children are all buried inside of this small vault. The space inside of the vault must be incredibly tight, and each time the vault was opened, it could have led to further damage to Mary Queen of Scots' coffin. Today, the tomb of Mary Queen of Scots can be visited and walked around, and it is one of the greatest tombs inside of Westminster Abbey. She was interred close to the site of Elizabeth I, directly opposite, showing even in death that the pair are rivals. Mary was subjected to a terrifying execution, and she went to her death with dignity. But the chaos inside of her burial vault still exists today, as many other coffins are rammed into this alongside the crumbling coffin of the executed Queen of Scots. King George II grew up in Hanover, and he married in 1705 the beautiful Caroline of Ansbach. His father was made the British king, and with this, George Augustus, as he was known, became the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. But George I hated his son, and they had argued for many years in public. Prince George's house in London, known as Leicester House, eventually became a place where dissenting politicians, led by Sir Robert Walpole, would meet and discuss things, but George I and his son did eventually somehow reconcile slightly. But Prince George had a number of close friends who later became his ministers when he became the king. George II became king in 1727 following his father's death, and he did exercise little power over what happened inside of his nation, becoming the constitutional monarch that we have in Britain today. His reign and his rule was dominated by Parliament, and he would actually spend more time in Hanover during the summer, where he had more control and power, leaving the government to run England. George II also was the most recent British king to lead an army into battle at the Battle of Dettingen during the War of Austrian Succession, but he, like his father, had a difficult relationship with his son Frederick, who supported his opponents in Parliament, and George II spent a lot of time arguing with him. He also faced the final Jacobite rebellion as Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender, landed in Scotland, but he would be defeated following brief success at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. But as mentioned, much of his reign was categorised by political instability and infighting in the government, and during the final years of his reign, George II took a step back, and he had little interest in politics and seemingly let his government get on with running the country. He was a man who loved the military and armed forces and loved the idea of commanding troops in battle. However, he had no interest in reading or education, or the arts and science, which were all flourishing at the time. He would have rather been out on his lands hunting or gambling money playing cards, and during his reign, British interests did expand throughout the world, but some people consider George a rather faintly ludicrous king, and many have criticised him. Other historians have considered that he did the right thing with regards to the running of Britain. As one stated, "With him our laws and liberties were safe. he possessed in a great degree of confidence of his people and the respect of foreign governments, and a certain steadiness of character made him of great consequence in these unsettled times. His character would not afford subject for epic poetry, but will look well in the sober page of history. By the October of 1760, King George II was suffering with his health. He was blind in one eye and could not hear very well, and on the 25th of October he woke up at roughly 6 a.m. and had his usual cup of hot chocolate to begin the day. He then went to the toilet, but a loud crash was heard minutes later, and his valet entered the room to see the king unconscious on the floor. It was claimed that King George II, he appeared to have just come from his necessary stall as if he was going to open his escritoire, a small piece of furniture. George II was taken to his bed and Princess Amelia was sent for. However, by the time she got there, the king was already dead, and he was almost 77 years old, the longest living king of Britain at the time. Following his death, his body was subjected to embalming in the same manner that had happened before for centuries. He was the final monarch to have his remains dealt with in this manner, and following his death, surgeons made a large cut into his chest, and they studied his remains and concluded that he died of a thoracic aortic dissection, or a huge heart attack. The embalming process removed King George II's heart and his other internal organs. These were then placed inside of a visceral urn, a separate pot for his remains to be kept out of his coffin during burial. This was done to ensure that the remains did not decay quickly, and the chest cavity was then filled with perfumes after being washed and other spices to try and keep away decay. After this was done, the body of George II was wrapped in a thick cloth known as cerecloth, a wax-coated shroud that would keep his body preserved. Some cerecloths have been found to have been so effective that even the remains of kings who died 700 years ago are remarkably still preserved today. King George II was also the final monarch to be buried inside of Westminster Abbey. His funeral and burial took place on the 11th of November 1760, and his coffin was carried in through the north door of the abbey. And he had left instructions for his remains to be placed with his wife's coffin, but strangely, so that the sides of the coffins could be removed, so that they could not be entombed in a shell, but instead to be open to the elements, so they could, in a strange, but I suppose sweet way, be closer to each other. This was a sweet idea, however. Because Westminster Abbey was getting rather full with the burials of kings and queens, work was done on a vault to contain the remains of George II. With regards to the funeral, it was said that the procession through a line of foot guards, every seventh man bearing a torch, the horse guards lining the outsides, their officers with drawn sabres and crape sashes on horseback, the drums muffled, the fifes, bells tolling, and minutes guns. All this was very solemn. Following the funeral procession, which was done under torchlight, people pushed forwards to get a decent view of the burial vault in which King George II would be interred inside of. People began to sit and stand where they could to get a good view, and the yeomen of the guard, who were carrying the king's heavy coffin, asked for help to clear a path. There was a lack of decorum with this burial, and there was later even reports during the procession about deaths of people who had been crushed. A series of vaults under Westminster Abbey, it's believed, were constructed opposite the tomb of King Edward VI in 1728, after George II came onto the throne, and he had probably intended one of these being his resting place. A larger vault under the central part of King Henry VII's Lady Chapel was created, and work was done very quickly on this in 1737. The floor of the chapel was removed and a deep excavation was done, with a stone complex being constructed with different chambers for members of the royal family. This work was completed when George III's queen had died and she was interred here. It was here, where King George II was buried, and a black marble bronze-handled double sarcophagus at the eastern end of this vault housed the bodies of the King, George II, and his Queen. In this sarcophagus, the coffins of George II and Queen Caroline did have their sideboards removed, so they were closer in death. The visceral chests containing the removed heart and internal organs of the King and Queen were also placed at the side on a shelf, and these were noted to have been leather-covered boxes. Now, as this vault was so large in its construction, it allowed other members of the royal family over the decades to be buried alongside George II, and this included Henry Frederick, the Duke of Cumberland, who was laid to rest in 1790. There is today no large tomb or monument to the King inside of Westminster Abbey, just a small inscription on the white floor tile that says, King George II, 1760. But this burial vault has been opened a number of times and has been investigated. In 1871, the vault was opened, and then in 1943, Dean Labriere opened the vault and he assessed the contents of the vault. He looked at George II's remains and Queen Caroline's, and he noted that they were scarcely any signs of decay, showing that the embalming process had worked very well in this case. Today, kings and queens are not embalmed in the way that King George II was. He was the final monarch to have this sort of treatment after death, and it was done to preserve the body in the hope of one day the monarch resurrecting. Internal organs were removed to keep the body as fresh as it could be and to prevent rotting from within, but still today the embalmed corpse of George II sits under the floor of Westminster Abbey in a stone vault with the side of the coffin open. Thousands of people visit the Abbey every single day, and they walk past the site where George's vault is. I personally myself have walked past it. One of the most shocking and notorious queens ever to have ruled over England was the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, who was known as Bloody Mary. She was the queen who burned over 200 people at the stake for their differing religious beliefs, and Mary's short but brief reign was one which was very turbulent. She would reverse the huge religious changes her brother Edward VI and father made, and this led people to be rather confused, and they did not know where they stood. But Mary's reign was not long, and many believed she would never be a ruling queen. However, Mary suffered with a lot of severe health problems in her life, and these eventually contributed to her death. Mary I died at the age of 42 inside of St James's Palace, and Mary was then buried inside of a burial vault in Westminster Abbey, close to where her grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, were buried. But the burial vault of Mary I was disturbed a number of times, and shockingly, when it was last opened, what those people found was shocking. Mary I, despite being the ruthless monarch who burned many people at the stake, was a woman who suffered a great deal with her health and well-being. She was a young woman who had many problems that led to the royal doctors and physicians considering that she would not live very long, and the physicians believed she would die before she would ever become queen or be considered to have been a martyr. She was living in the 16th century, a time where there were huge disease outbreaks plaguing England. Mary suffered with a number of serious swellings in her stomach when she became queen, and she believed she was pregnant, but no child ever came. And today it's considered that she suffered from ovarian or uterine cancer. But in 1558, Mary I made preparations for her death, and she claimed that she wanted Philip II to act as the regent if she ever had a child, but this would not be popular, as Philip was hated. There were never any children ever born to Mary I, and with this she then had to consider who her successor would be, and she turned to her great rival, Elizabeth, her half-sister, who would go on to become Queen Elizabeth I. In 1558, there was a huge amount of influenza and flu, which was causing chaos across England, and it was killing people at the rate of which the Black Death was. The flu lingered on, and it would claim its victims over time. But Mary tried to avoid the disease, but in the summer of 1558, she was suffering with depression and a huge lack of sleep. It was said in August that Mary had dropsy, and she had a fever which was low, and because of this she was considered on death's door. Because of this, Mary moved from Hampton Court Palace to St James's Palace, and she did have a high fever, bouts of dizziness and confusion, and also severe headaches. Mary also went blind, and she did recover a bit. However, with her growing depression and severe fever, she continued to go downhill. In the October of 1558, many of Mary's advisers had to make a decision, and the Privy Council then convinced the Queen to make her will, and they considered their own positions, and many began to schmooze Elizabeth in preparation for Mary's death, and they wanted a role inside of her new government. But in her final days, Mary did name Elizabeth her successor, and she went blind as her servants began to pray for her soul. She had bizarre dreams, and in the morning of the 17th of November 1558, she had a final mass said for her, and at around 4 a.m. she died peacefully. The servants believed she had fallen asleep, but she died, and the doctors confirmed her death. The funeral service was then planned, and it was to take place at Westminster Abbey. Mary I's reign over England was very short, but she made history, being the first queen to reign in her own right after being crowned during a coronation. And she was interred inside of Westminster Abbey. Her body was taken to Westminster in a large procession. On top of the coffin was a lifelike effigy of Mary, which was wearing coronation robes, and it had her orb and sceptre on the coffin also. It was Mary's show of royal power and importance even in her death, and despite the fact she was a very unpopular monarch, the funeral procession then made its way into Westminster Abbey. But Mary was then buried inside of the north side of Henry VII's Lady Chapel. There, today, is little that marks the reign or life of Mary I in her death and demise. There's no funeral effigy or tomb. There isn't a grand memorial either, just a small stone that says that Mary I was buried there. But in the 19th century, the tomb of Mary I was broken into and opened. However, one thing to consider is that this was not the first time it was broken into. Elizabeth I, following her death, was initially buried inside of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's tomb, but James I, her successor, then ordered the exhumation of Elizabeth so that she could be buried in the same vault as Mary. Because of this, Mary's coffin was moved, and actually, in an act of disgrace against the former Catholic Queen, Elizabeth I's coffin was placed directly on top of Mary's to signal that Elizabeth was much more important than Mary. But in 1880, Arthur Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, encountered the burial vault of Mary I, and he wrote an account on what he saw. He found the coffins of Mary and Elizabeth, and he recorded what he saw, and he said, "The excavations, however, had almost laid bare the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view was obtained into a long, narrow vanlet immediately beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed 2 coffins, and 2 only, and it could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary, the upper one larger and more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except that the centering wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides, and had drawn away part vault of the decaying lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately the dim light fell on a fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There was a Tudor badge, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in outline on the middle of the cover, on each side the August initial E.R. and below the memorial date 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with narrow modelling panelling, and the coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid contained the inscription, and panelling was of fine oak, half an inch thick, laid on the inch elm cover. The whole was covered in red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak covers, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded and narrow tomb thus compressing in the closest grasp the two Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection. The solemn majesty of the great queen thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive from the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and of the fullness of its tragic interest with the vacancy of the deserted spaces which had been hitherto explored in the other parts of the chapel. The vault was then immediately closed. But still today, the death and life of Mary I is not the most celebrated inside of Westminster Abbey, and Elizabeth I's tomb, which sits above Mary's body, is grand and ornate. Mary I was never given her own burial vault, unlike many other kings and queens buried inside of Westminster. Her vault is not filled with the coffins of others, and still today it's believed only her and Elizabeth's coffin lay in the vault.